The notification popped up on my screen at exactly 2:47 a.m. New friend request from someone called Forest Wanderer. I stared at the username for a moment, my cursor hovering over the accept button. Something about it felt familiar, though I couldn't place why. After 3 years of making Roblox horror content, I'd gotten hundreds of random friend requests from viewers, but this one was different. The account had no avatar, no games played, no badges, just a blank profile created moments before the request was sent. I should have ignored it, should have closed my laptop and gone to bed like any rational person would at nearly 3 in the morning. But curiosity killed more than just cats, and I clicked accept before I could talk myself out of it. Within seconds, a message appeared in my chat. You need to play this game. It's not what it seems. Attached was a link to something called 99 Nights in the Forest. The description was minimal, almost cryptic. Survive 99 nights in a supernatural forest while searching for 4 missing children. Build shelters. Gather resources. Avoid the creatures that hunt when darkness falls. Based on true events. That last line made my stomach twist. Every horror game claimed to be based on true events these days, but something about the way it was written here felt different, more genuine, more desperate. My name is Jake, and I've been creating horror gaming content for over 3 years now. Started when I was 16, just a kid with too much free time and an unhealthy obsession with things that go bump in the night. I'd played everything from haunted pizzerias to cursed elevators, from supernatural hotels to possessed dolls that followed you through endless mazes. But this game, this 99 Nights in the Forest, it was going to change everything. Not just for my channel, but for my entire understanding of what was real and what wasn't. The line between digital horror and actual terror was about to blur in ways I never could have imagined. I clicked the link and waited for the game to load. My setup wasn't anything fancy, just a decent gaming laptop and a headset that had seen better days, but it had served me well enough for 3 years of content creation. The loading screen that appeared made my breath catch in my throat. 4 silhouettes of children stood against a backdrop of towering trees that seemed to stretch infinitely upward. The image was rendered in sepia tones, giving it an old photograph quality that felt hauntingly authentic. The text beneath the image was simple but chilling. Emma, Marcus, Lily, and Samuel, lost in the Whispering Woods, October 15th, 1987. Their voices still call for help. October 15th, 1987. That was oddly specific for a fictional game. Most horror games used vague dates or completely made-up timelines, but this felt like someone had pulled an actual date from a real missing persons report. The loading bar filled slowly, and with each percentage point, I felt my anticipation building. This wasn't just another jump-scare fest or monster chase simulator. This felt important somehow, like I was about to uncover something that had been buried for decades. The game finally loaded, and I found myself spawning in a dense forest clearing. The graphics were surprisingly sophisticated for a ROBLOX game. Individual leaves rustled on branches overhead, casting shifting shadows across the forest floor. Shafts of golden sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating an almost peaceful atmosphere that I knew wouldn't last long. In the center of the clearing stood the remnants of what looked like an old campsite. A circle of stones surrounded a cold fire pit, and scattered around the area were pieces of camping equipment that had clearly seen better days. But it was the small backpack lying half buried in fallen leaves that made my heart skip. Pink fabric, child-sized, with a name tag barely visible beneath the dirt and decay. Emma, written in faded black marker, the kind of careful lettering that screamed elementary school student trying her best to write neatly. I started recording immediately. Years of content creation had taught me to recognize when something special was happening, and every instinct I had was screaming that this game was going to be different. As I moved my character around the clearing, I noticed details that most games would never bother with. Claw marks gouged deep into nearby tree trunks, far too high for any normal animal to reach. Strange symbols carved into bark, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. And everywhere, scattered like breadcrumbs through the undergrowth, were personal belongings that clearly didn't belong to any NPC. A child's sneaker, size small, wedged between two rocks near what looked like a dried streambed. A stuffed animal, once white but now stained brown with age and weather, missing one button eye. A small plastic compass, the kind you'd find in a cereal box, its needle spinning wildly no matter which direction I faced. Each item told a story, painted a picture of children who had been here, who had tried to find their way home and failed. The game's interface was minimalist, which I appreciated. No cluttered UI or distracting elements, just a simple health bar, a stamina indicator, and a day counter that currently read, Day 1 of 99. In the corner of my screen, a small icon showed a campfire with the text, Keep the fire burning. It's your only protection after dark. I spent the first few hours exploring the immediate area around the clearing, gathering the basic resources the game allowed. Fallen branches for firewood, scattered stones to reinforce the fire pit, and various pieces of scrap metal and cloth that could be used for crafting simple tools. The survival mechanics felt realistic without being overly complicated. No magical crafting recipes or impossible resource combinations, just practical wilderness survival techniques that someone might actually use if they found themselves lost in the woods. As I explored, I began to piece together what had happened here. The scattered camping equipment suggested that someone had tried to establish a permanent base camp in this clearing. The arrangement of stones around the fire pit was too deliberate to be natural, and the way the larger logs were positioned created natural seating areas that spoke of careful planning. But something had gone wrong. Something had forced whoever was here to abandon their carefully constructed shelter and flee into the dark woods beyond. The first night fell faster than I expected. One moment, I was exploring a game world bathed in golden afternoon sunlight, and the next I was scrambling to get my campfire lit as shadows began to creep across the forest floor. The transition wasn't gradual like in most games. Instead, darkness seemed to pour into the clearing like ink spreading through water, consuming light and warmth with aggressive hunger. The moment the sun disappeared completely, everything changed. The peaceful forest sounds, the gentle rustling of leaves and distant bird calls were replaced by something far more sinister. Low growls echoed from the darkness beyond my firelight, accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps circling my position. Not the quick, light steps of small forest animals, but deliberate, measured movements that spoke of intelligence and predatory intent. I huddled near my campfire, watching the flames dance and flicker, providing a small circle of safety in an ocean of threatening darkness. The fire's light only extended about 10 feet in every direction, creating a tiny island of visibility in what felt like an endless void. Beyond that protective circle, shadows moved with purpose, and occasionally I caught glimpses of things that shouldn't exist. Pale shapes that might have been faces, watching me from between the trees. Eyes that reflected my firelight like polished glass, always in pairs, always tracking my movements. The audio design was phenomenal. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, every distant howl seemed to come from a different direction, creating a three-dimensional soundscape that made me constantly look over my shoulder, even though I was sitting safely in my bedroom. The developers had clearly understood that true horror comes not from what you see, but from what you think you see, what you imagine lurking just beyond the edge of perception. As the night progressed, the sounds grew bolder. Whatever was out there began testing the boundaries of my firelight, probing for weaknesses. I heard something large moving through the underbrush, circling my camp in a wide arc, never quite coming close enough for me to get a clear look, but always making sure I knew it was there. The psychological pressure was intense, and I found myself jumping at every shadow, every flicker of the flames that made the darkness seem to reach toward me with grasping fingers. Then I heard it, a sound that made my blood freeze in my veins and my hands shake on the mouse. It started as a whisper, so quiet I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. But gradually it grew louder, more distinct, until there was no denying what I was hearing. A child's voice calling out from somewhere in the darkness beyond my campfire. "Help me! Please, someone help me!" The voice was young, maybe 7 or 8 years old, filled with the kind of terror that no child should ever have to experience. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees with a quality that suggested vast distances and desperate loneliness. My character's breathing became laboured, and I realised the game was responding to the emotional intensity of the moment, creating a feedback loop between digital horror and genuine fear. I can't find my way back. It's so dark, and I'm scared. The voice came again, closer this time, and I found myself leaning forward in my chair, straining to see beyond the circle of firelight. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to grab a torch and venture into the darkness, to find whatever child was lost out there and bring them to safety. But the game's mechanics were clear. Leave the fire, and you die. The flames were my only protection against whatever predators stalked the night, and abandoning that safety would mean certain death. "Please don't leave me alone, the monster is coming." Those words hit me like a physical blow. The raw terror in that young voice, the absolute conviction that something terrible was approaching, made me feel like the worst kind of coward for staying safely by my fire. But what choice did I have? This was just a game, just pixels and sound files designed to create an emotional response. The logical part of my brain kept repeating that mantra, but my heart wasn't listening. The voice called out several more times throughout that first night, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always filled with the same desperate pleading for help. Each time I heard it, I felt a little piece of my soul die. Even knowing this was fiction, even understanding that no real child was in danger, the emotional impact was devastating. The developers had created something that transcended mere entertainment and entered the realm of psychological torture. When dawn finally broke, the relief was overwhelming. The oppressive darkness retreated like a living thing, pulling back into the deepest parts of the forest where sunlight couldn't penetrate. The threatening sounds faded away, replaced once again by normal forest ambience. Birds began to sing, leaves rustled gently in the morning breeze, and my character's laboured breathing returned to normal. But the memory of that voice lingered. Even in the safety of daylight, I couldn't shake the sound of a terrified child calling for help from somewhere in the darkness. The game had marked me somehow, left an impression that would stay with me long after I logged off. This wasn't just another horror game to play through for content. This was something deeper, something that demanded to be taken seriously. As I sat there in the morning light, planning my second day in the forest, I had no idea that I was about to embark on a journey that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the boundary between fiction and reality. The voice I'd heard wasn't just a sound file created by some talented audio designer. It was something far more complex and disturbing, something that would force me to question not just the nature of the game I was playing, but the very nature of consciousness itself. The second day began with an unsettling discovery that made my stomach churn. As I ventured beyond my campsite to gather more resources, I found fresh footprints in the soft earth near the dried stream bed. Small footprints, the size a child might make, pressed deep into the mud as if someone had been running. The prints led away from my camp, deeper into the forest where the trees grew thicker and the shadows seemed to swallow light itself. I followed them for about 50 yards before they simply vanished, not gradually faded or became obscured by harder ground, but literally disappeared mid-stride, as if whoever had made them had simply ceased to exist. The last print was deeper than the others, with what looked like claw marks gouged into the earth beside it. Something had caught whoever was running, and the struggle had been brief. My hands trembled as I adjusted my headset, trying to process what I was seeing. The game's attention to detail was beyond anything I'd experienced before. These weren't generic texture stamps or randomly generated elements. Someone had carefully crafted each footprint, each disturbed leaf, each broken twig, to tell a specific story. The level of environmental storytelling was so sophisticated that I found myself questioning whether this was actually a game at all, or something else entirely. As I continued exploring, I discovered more evidence of the children's presence. A small cave hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines contained what looked like a makeshift shelter. Leaves and branches had been arranged to create a windbreak, and stones formed a circle where someone had obviously tried to build a fire. The attempt had failed, leaving only charred sticks and cold ashes that somehow seemed to radiate despair. Scratched into the cave wall were 4 names, carved with what looked like a sharp stone: Emma, Marcus, Lily, Samuel. Below the names, in smaller letters that I had to squint to read, were the words, Day 12. We can't find the way out. The monster took Marcus last night. We heard him screaming, but it stopped so suddenly. Emma says we have to keep moving, but Lily won't stop crying. I'm so scared. The message was signed with a shaky L that had to be from Lily. My character's breathing had become laboured again, and I noticed my own heart was racing as I read those desperate words. The game was affecting me on a physiological level, triggering genuine stress responses that went far beyond typical gaming experiences. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was psychological warfare. I spent the rest of the day gathering resources and fortifying my camp, but my mind kept returning to those carved words. Day 12. If the children had survived 12 days in this nightmare forest, they were far more resourceful than I'd initially assumed. But if something had taken Marcus on day 12, what had happened to the other 3? Were they still out there, still running, still hoping someone would find them? The second night brought new horrors. The child's voice returned, but this time it wasn't alone. As darkness fell and I huddled around my campfire, I heard multiple voices calling from the blackness beyond my protective circle of light. A girl's voice, older than the first, pleading for someone to help her find her little brother. A boy's voice, cracking with adolescent uncertainty, shouting directions that made no sense. And underneath it all, the soft sobbing of someone very young, very scared and very lost. Lily, stay close to me, the older girl's voice called out. Don't look at it. Don't let it see you looking. I want to go home, came the sobbing response. I want Mommy. Why can't we go home? Because the bad people won't let us, a boy's voice answered, filled with an anger that seemed too mature for his years. They brought us here, and now we're part of their experiment. But we're going to get out. We're going to tell everyone what they did. The conversations felt so genuine, so authentic, that I found myself trying to respond. I actually opened my chat box and typed messages, trying to communicate with the voices, but nothing I said seemed to reach them. They continued their desperate dialogue as if I didn't exist, as if they were trapped in their own separate reality that only occasionally intersected with mine. As the night progressed, the voices grew more frantic. I heard running footsteps, branches snapping, and what sounded like a chase scene playing out just beyond my vision. The older girl's voice became increasingly desperate as she tried to keep her group together, while something large and predatory hunted them through the darkness. This way, there's a clearing ahead. I can't run anymore, Emma, my legs hurt. You have to try, Lily, it's right behind us. I can hear it breathing. Then came the sound that would haunt my dreams for weeks afterward. A roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the digital world, followed by a scream of pure terror that cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of something large moving through the underbrush and the quiet sobbing of children who had just watched their friend disappear into the darkness. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the chase had been. No more voices calling out, no more desperate conversations, just the oppressive quiet of a forest that had swallowed another victim. I sat by my fire, staring into the flames, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. The audio had been so realistic, so emotionally devastating, that part of me wondered if I was somehow listening to actual recordings of real events. But that was impossible. This was a ROBLOX game, created by developers who understood how to craft compelling horror experiences. The voices were just sound files, carefully scripted and performed to create maximum emotional impact. The fact that they felt real was a testament to the skill of the voice actors and sound designers. Nothing more, or so I kept telling myself. Dawn brought no relief this time. As the sun rose over the forest, I discovered that my campsite had been visited during the night. Items had been moved, rearranged in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. My pile of gathered wood had been formed into a rough approximation of a cross, and stones from my fire pit had been arranged in a circle around it. Most disturbing of all, there were new footprints in the soft earth around my camp. Not the small prints of children this time, but large, heavy impressions that looked almost human, but were somehow wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. The game's interface had changed too. Where once it had shown day 2 of 99, it now displayed day 2 of, as if the system itself was no longer certain how long this nightmare would last. In the corner of my screen, a new icon had appeared, a small eye, watching, blinking occasionally, in a way that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore these changes and focus on exploration, but the forest itself seemed different during my 3rd day. Paths that had been clear the day before were now blocked by fallen trees or thick undergrowth. Areas I'd explored thoroughly had somehow rearranged themselves, creating new clearings and hiding others. The game was evolving, adapting, changing its layout based on my actions in ways that defied conventional programming logic. That's when I found the first photograph. It was pinned to a tree trunk about a mile from my camp, held in place by a rusty nail driven deep into the bark. The image was old, faded, the kind of Polaroid snapshot that families took during camping trips in the 80s. 4 children stood in front of a large recreational vehicle, smiling at the camera with the innocent joy that only comes from anticipating a great adventure. The oldest looked to be about 13, a girl with long brown hair and a gap-toothed grin. Next to her stood a boy of maybe 9, holding a fishing rod and wearing a baseball cap that was slightly too big for his head. A younger girl, perhaps 7, clutched a stuffed animal that looked suspiciously familiar. And in front of them all, a toddler, barely old enough to stand on his own, reaching toward the camera with chubby fingers. Written on the back of the photograph in faded blue ink were the names I'd seen carved into the cave wall: Emma, Marcus, Lily, Samuel. Below that, in what looked like a child's handwriting, someone had added, "Our last happy day." I stared at that photograph for a long time, my mind racing to process what I was seeing. The image quality was too good to be a simple texture created for the game. The details were too specific, too authentic. The way the light fell across the children's faces, the natural poses, the genuine smiles, everything about it screamed that this was a real photograph of real children. But that was impossible. This was a game, a digital creation designed to tell a fictional story. The developers had probably found this image online, maybe purchased it from a stock photo site and incorporated it into their narrative. There had to be a logical explanation for why it felt so genuine, so heartbreakingly real. I took a screenshot of the photograph and continued exploring, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. Something about seeing those faces, those innocent smiles, had fundamentally changed my relationship with the game. These weren't just characters in a horror story anymore. They felt like real people, real children who had suffered real trauma. The weight of their tragedy was settling on my shoulders like a physical burden. The third night brought a change in the pattern. Instead of distant voices calling from the darkness, I heard something approaching my camp directly. Heavy footsteps crunched through the undergrowth, moving in a slow, deliberate circle around my fire. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to be stealthy. It wanted me to know it was there, wanted me to feel the terror of being hunted by something that could end my existence whenever it chose. I caught my first clear glimpse of the creature when it passed between two trees at the very edge of my firelight. The sight nearly made me fall out of my chair. It stood upright like a human, but its proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung down past its knees, ending in what looked like claws, but it was the head that made my blood freeze. The skull of a massive deer, complete with a rack of antlers that seemed to scrape against the low-hanging branches above. The creature didn't attack. It just stood there at the edge of my vision, watching me with empty eye sockets that somehow conveyed an intelligence far more terrifying than any mindless beast. I could hear my character's breathing, rapid and panicked, perfectly matching my own racing heartbeat. The attention to detail was incredible and absolutely horrifying. When the creature finally moved, it didn't charge or rush toward me like I expected. Instead, it began walking around my camp in a slow, measured pace, never taking its hollow gaze off me. Each footstep made a sound like breaking bones, and I could see its massive head tilting from side to side as if it was studying me, deciding how it wanted to proceed. Then it did something that nearly made me quit the game entirely. It spoke. Not in the growling, inhuman voice you might expect from a monster, but in a voice that was disturbingly human. A man's voice, cultured and educated, with the kind of tone you'd expect from a university professor or research scientist. "You shouldn't be here," it said, the words carrying clearly across the distance between us. "This place is not meant for the living." The children learned that lesson far too late. I tried to respond, typing frantically in the chat box, but the creature continued as if I hadn't spoken. They came here with such hope, such innocent excitement about their camping adventure. A family trip to create memories that would last a lifetime. How sadly ironic that turned out to be. The creature stopped its pacing and turned to face me directly. Even though it had no eyes, I felt the full weight of its attention focused on me like a laser beam. The parents never knew what really happened. Oh, there was a search, of course. Helicopters, search dogs, volunteers combing every inch of these woods. But they were looking in the wrong place, for the wrong thing. The children weren't lost. They were taken, selected, chosen for something far more important than a simple camping trip. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely control my mouse. The creature's words were hitting me with the force of physical blows, each revelation more disturbing than the last. This wasn't just a monster designed to provide jump scares. This was something with a story to tell, a truth that demanded to be heard. The research facility was hidden deep in these woods, far from prying eyes and government oversight. Private funding, private agenda, private morality that existed outside the boundaries of conventional ethics. The children weren't victims of some random forest predator. They were subjects in an experiment that pushed the boundaries of consciousness itself. The creature began moving again, but this time it was walking directly toward me. Each step brought it closer to the edge of my protective firelight, and I found myself leaning back in my chair as if physical distance could somehow protect me from what was coming. "I was part of that research team," the creature continued, its voice growing closer and more intimate. "Dr. Harrison Blackwood, specialist in pediatric neurology and consciousness transfer. I believed we were doing important work, advancing human understanding of the mind-body connection. I believed the ends would justify the means. The creature stopped, just at the very edge of my firelight, close enough that I could see the intricate details of its skull, the way shadows played across the bone surface, the dark stains around its mouth that I didn't want to think about too closely. The children were so brave, so trusting. Even when the procedures began, even when they realized something was terribly wrong, they maintained a dignity and courage that shamed us all. Emma tried to protect the younger ones. Marcus attempted to fight back despite his fear. Lily sang lullabies to comfort Samuel when the pain became unbearable, and Samuel, barely more than a baby, somehow understood that he was surrounded by love even in the midst of horror. Tears were streaming down my face as I listened to the creature's confession. The emotional weight of what I was hearing was overwhelming, made worse by the fact that part of me was beginning to believe it might actually be true. The details were too specific, too emotionally resonant to be simple fiction. When the experiment reached its final phase, when we realized what we had done could never be undone, some of us tried to stop it. But it was too late. The children's consciousness had already been separated from their physical forms, uploaded into a digital matrix that we barely understood. Their bodies failed, but their minds, their spirits, their essential selves remained trapped in a prison of code and data. The creature raised one clawed hand towards me, and I instinctively flinched away from the screen. I volunteered to be the first adult subject, hoping to find a way to reverse the process, to free the children from their digital hell. But the procedure changed me, transformed me into something that was neither fully human nor completely digital. I became the guardian of this place, the protector of children who could no longer protect themselves. The fire between us flickered and dimmed, and I realized with growing horror that my fuel was running low. If the flames died completely, there would be nothing standing between me and this creature that claimed to be a human scientist, transformed into something monstrous. "The game you're playing isn't entertainment," the creature said, its voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "It's a memorial, a digital graveyard where the children's consciousness continues to exist. Every player who enters this world becomes part of their story, a witness to their suffering and their courage." As dawn approached and the creature began to fade back into the shadows, it left me with words that would echo in my mind for days to come. "Find them," it whispered. "Find all 4 children and help them understand what happened to them. Only then can they find peace. Only then can any of us find peace." The sun rose on my 4th day in the forest, but I felt no relief from the darkness that had settled over my soul. The creature's story had fundamentally changed my understanding of what I was experiencing. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was something far more complex and disturbing, something that demanded to be taken seriously. I knew I had to continue, had to find Emma, Marcus, Lily, and Samuel, not just for the sake of completing the game, but because 4 children were counting on me to help them find the peace they had been denied for so long. The forest was waiting, and somewhere in its digital depths, 4 young voices were calling for help. The 4th day began with a discovery that made every muscle in my body tense with dread. As I ventured beyond my usual scavenging routes, searching for more substantial building materials, I stumbled upon something that shouldn't have existed in any game. A research facility, half buried beneath decades of forest growth, its concrete walls cracked and overgrown with thick vines that seemed to pulse with their own dark energy. The entrance was partially blocked by fallen debris, but there was enough space for my character to squeeze through. My cursor hovered over the gap for several minutes as I debated whether to enter. Every horror game instinct I'd developed over 3 years of content creation was screaming at me to stay away, to stick to the relative safety of the forest above. But the creature's words from the previous night echoed in my mind. "Find them. Find all 4 children." I took a deep breath and guided my character through the opening. The interior of the facility was a nightmare of rusted equipment and shattered glass. Emergency lighting flickered sporadically, casting eerie red shadows that danced across walls covered in what looked like research charts and medical diagrams. The air itself seemed thick and oppressive, and I noticed my character's movement had become sluggish, as if the very atmosphere was trying to hold me back. The first room I entered appeared to be some kind of reception area. A desk sat in the center, its surface covered with scattered papers that looked far too detailed to be simple game textures. I moved closer to examine them and felt my heart sink as I read the headers. Subject intake forms, medical consent documents signed by parents who had no idea what they were agreeing to, and most chilling of all, progress reports detailing the mental and physical condition of 4 specific subjects. Subject A, female, age 13. Emma, high intelligence, natural leadership qualities, protective instincts toward younger subjects, responds well to authority figures but shows increasing resistance to procedure protocols. Subject B, male, age 9. Marcus, curious nature, asks frequent questions about facility procedures, physical strength above average for age group, beginning to show signs of aggressive behavior toward research staff. Subject C, female, age 7. Lily, artistic temperament, uses drawing and singing as coping mechanisms. Emotional attachment to stuffed animal must be maintained for psychological stability. Shows signs of dissociation during extended sessions. Subject D, male, age 2. Samuel, youngest subject in program history. Remarkable adaptability to facility environment. Requires constant supervision due to age-appropriate behavioral patterns. I read each report with growing horror, my hands shaking as I scrolled through page after page of clinical observations that treated these children like laboratory animals. The language was cold, detached, professional in a way that made the content even more disturbing. These weren't fictional characters in a horror game. These were detailed psychological profiles of real children who had suffered unimaginable trauma. Moving deeper into the facility, I discovered room after room of abandoned equipment. Massive computers that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie. Their screens dark but somehow still ominous. Medical tables with restraints that were clearly designed for small bodies. And everywhere, scattered like confetti throughout the facility, were personal belongings that belonged to the children. Emma's journal, its pages filled with increasingly desperate entries as she tried to understand what was happening to her and her siblings. Marcus's baseball cards, carefully organized in a binder that showed how much thought and care he'd put into his collection. Lily's crayons, worn down to stubs from countless hours of drawing pictures that grew darker and more disturbing as her time in the facility progressed. Samuel's bottle, still half full of formula that had long since spoiled, each discovery felt like a punch to the gut. The level of detail was beyond anything I'd ever encountered in a game before. Someone had put enormous thought and effort into creating these artifacts, into making them feel authentic and emotionally resonant. But why? What was the point of creating something so elaborate for what was supposedly just a ROBLOX horror experience? I found the answer in the facility's main laboratory, a vast chamber filled with equipment that defied easy description. Banks of monitors surrounded a central platform, where 4 medical chairs sat in a perfect circle, their surfaces stained with substances I didn't want to identify. Above each chair hung a complex array of wires and sensors, all leading to a massive central computer that hummed with barely contained energy. On the computer's main screen, text scrolled continuously in lines of code that looked far more sophisticated than anything ROBLOX's engine should have been capable of generating. But mixed in with the programming language were fragments of something else. Words, sentences, entire paragraphs that seemed to be trying to communicate. Help us. We're still here. We're still trapped. Please don't leave us alone in the darkness. The words repeated over and over, sometimes in different combinations, sometimes with subtle variations that suggested they weren't just pre-programmed responses, but actual attempts at communication. I stared at the screen, my mind racing to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. Games didn't work this way. Code didn't spontaneously generate pleas for help. But as I watched, new text began to appear. You found our prison. You found where they kept us when our bodies could no longer contain our minds. We've been waiting so long for someone to discover the truth. My character's breathing had become labored again, and I realized I was holding my own breath as I read. The text continued to scroll, and with each new line, my understanding of the situation grew more disturbing. The machine you're looking at is called the Consciousness Transfer Array. Dr. Blackwood and his team used it to extract our minds from our dying bodies and upload them into a digital matrix. They thought they were preserving us, saving us from death. They had no idea they were condemning us to something far worse. I tried typing a response, but my words appeared nowhere on the screen. The text continued, as if I hadn't attempted to communicate. We exist now in a space between worlds, neither fully alive nor completely dead. Our consciousness floats in digital limbo, experiencing every moment of our final days over and over again. The fear, the pain, the desperate hope that someone would rescue us before it was too late. But no one came. No one except you. The laboratory around me began to change. The flickering emergency light steadied, casting the room in a warm golden glow that reminded me of late afternoon sunlight. The rusted equipment became clean and functional, humming with the quiet efficiency of machines in perfect working order. I was witnessing the facility as it had been during its operational period, seeing through the eyes of children who had been brought here under false pretenses. Through the laboratory's observation windows, I could see into adjacent rooms where other equipment monitored vital signs and brain activity. Charts on the walls tracked the progress of the consciousness transfer process, showing how 4 young minds had been slowly and methodically separated from their physical forms. The clinical precision of it all made my stomach churn. The transformation continued until I was looking at the facility as it had been on its final day of operation. The chairs were occupied now, and my heart nearly stopped as I saw them. 4 children, unconscious and connected to the transfer array by dozens of wires and sensors. Their faces were peaceful, almost serene, but their bodies showed the ravages of whatever procedures they had endured. They looked like they were sleeping, but there was something wrong with the stillness, something that suggested they would never wake up again. Emma lay in the chair closest to me, her long brown hair spread across the headrest like a dark halo. Even unconscious, her face showed the stress lines of someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly, who had carried responsibilities no 13-year-old should ever have to bear. Her hand was stretched toward the next chair, as if even in her final moments she had been trying to comfort her younger brother. Marcus looked smaller than his 9 years, his body diminished by whatever the researchers had done to him. His baseball cap sat on a nearby table, carefully folded and placed next to a get well card he had apparently been working on before the final procedure. The card was addressed to Lily, decorated with crayon drawings of flowers and rainbows, filled with the kind of innocent optimism that made his current situation even more heartbreaking. Lily herself looked like a sleeping angel, her face still round with childhood innocence, despite everything she had endured. Her stuffed animal was clutched tightly in her arms, and someone had braided small flowers into her hair. Even the researchers, it seemed, had recognized her need for beauty and comfort in her final hours. Samuel was the most difficult to look at. So young, barely more than a baby, connected to machines that dwarfed his tiny body. He looked lost and fragile, completely dependent on adults who had betrayed his trust in the most fundamental way possible. His thumb was in his mouth, and his free hand gripped a small blanket that looked hand-knitted, probably made with love by a mother who would never see her child again. The text on the central computer screen continued to scroll, but now it felt more personal, more intimate, as if the children were speaking directly to me. We remember everything. The day our parents dropped us off at what they thought was a summer camp. The gradual realization that something was wrong. The fear that grew stronger each day as the procedures became more invasive. Emma tried so hard to protect us, but there was nothing she could do against adults who had power and authority on their side. I found myself crying openly as I read their story, tears streaming down my face as I absorbed the full horror of what had been done to these innocent children. The game had transcended entertainment and become something closer to testimony, a digital memorial that demanded witness and acknowledgement. Marcus fought them every step of the way. He was so brave, so determined to find a way out of that place. He made plans, drew maps, tried to convince the staff that we were just normal kids who wanted to go home. But they saw us as specimens, as test subjects, whose only value lay in what they could learn from our suffering. The vision began to fade, the clean laboratory slowly returning to its current state of decay and abandonment. But the text continued to scroll, and I found myself leaning closer to the screen, desperate to hear more of their story. Lily never stopped believing that someone would come for us. Even when the procedures began, even when her body started to fail, she maintained a faith that good people existed in the world and that they would eventually find us. She sang lullabies to Samuel when he cried, told him stories about princes and princesses who lived happily ever after. Her courage in the face of absolute terror was the most beautiful and heartbreaking thing any of us had ever witnessed. I was sobbing now, completely overwhelmed by the emotional weight of what I was experiencing. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was a sacred trust, a responsibility that had been placed on my shoulders by 4 children who had suffered unimaginable horror and were still somehow finding ways to reach out to the living world. Samuel was too young to understand what was happening to him, but he sensed our fear and responded to it with the kind of pure, innocent love that only very young children possess. He would reach for us during the procedures, trying to offer comfort even when he was in pain himself. His presence reminded us of everything good and pure in the world, everything worth fighting to preserve. The text paused for a long moment, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for the next revelation. When it finally appeared, the words hit me with the force of a physical blow. We died on October 15th, 1987. Our bodies gave out one by one as the consciousness transfer process took its toll. But our minds, our spirits, our essential selves were preserved in the digital matrix. We exist now in a state between life and death, awareness without form, memory without substance. We can see the world through electronic devices, communicate through computer systems, influence digital environments in ways that the living don't understand. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process what I was reading. If this was true, if the children's consciousness had somehow been preserved in digital form, then the game I was playing wasn't just inspired by their story. It was their story, told by them, experienced through their preserved awareness. The game you're playing is our attempt to communicate with the living world. We've learned to manipulate code, to influence programming, to create experiences that will help people understand what happened to us. Every player who completes our story carries a piece of our truth back to the physical world. You're not just playing a game, you're becoming part of our testimony. The implications were staggering. If the children were somehow still conscious, still aware, still capable of communication through digital means, then every horror game player who had dismissed their story as fiction had missed something profound. They weren't just characters in a scary story. They were real people, trapped in a digital prison, reaching out for acknowledgement and justice. But we need more than just acknowledgement. We need someone to tell our story, to make sure the world knows what Dr. Blackwood and his team did to us. The research facility was destroyed to cover up their crimes, the evidence buried beneath tons of concrete and steel. Our parents were told we died in a camping accident, our bodies lost in a flash flood that washed away all traces of what really happened. I found myself nodding, making a silent promise to these 4 children that their story would be told. My channel had 50,000 subscribers, people who trusted me to bring them authentic horror content. But this was bigger than content creation. This was about justice, about making sure that 4 innocent children weren't forgotten by a world that had failed to protect them. The laboratory around me continued to decay, returning to its current state of abandonment and ruin. But the computer screen remained active, the text continuing to scroll with messages that felt increasingly urgent. Dr. Blackwood is still alive. He changed his name, relocated to another country, continues his research under different auspices. The other members of his team scattered to universities and research institutions around the world, carrying the knowledge they gained from our suffering. They've never faced consequences for what they did to us. They've never even acknowledged that we existed. My hands clenched into fists as I read these words. The idea that the people responsible for this atrocity were still out there, still free, still potentially harming other children, filled me with a rage that surprised me with its intensity. These weren't just characters in a horror story. If what I was reading was true, they were real people who had committed real crimes and escaped real justice. The text began to fade, the connection weakening as if the children's energy was running low, but their final message burned itself into my memory with crystal clarity. Find the others. Find the players who have completed our story and help them understand what they've experienced. Together, you can make sure our voices are heard. Together, you can make sure this never happens to anyone else. We're counting on you. Please don't let us down. The screen went dark, leaving me alone in the abandoned laboratory, with only the sound of my character's laboured breathing and the distant drip of water somewhere in the facility's depths. I sat in my gaming chair, staring at the blank screen, trying to process everything I had just experienced. If this was just a game, it was the most sophisticated and emotionally manipulative piece of software ever created. But if it was something more, if the children's consciousness had somehow found a way to communicate through digital means, then I had just been entrusted with the most important responsibility of my life. I made my way back through the facility, gathering every piece of evidence I could find. Documents, photographs, personal belongings, anything that might help corroborate the children's story. The game's inventory system seemed to expand to accommodate everything I collected, as if it understood the importance of preserving these artifacts. By the time I emerged from the underground facility, the sun was setting, and I could hear the familiar sounds of the forest's nocturnal predators beginning to stir. But I felt different now, changed by what I had discovered. I wasn't just a horror game player anymore. I was a witness, a keeper of testimony, a voice for children who could no longer speak for themselves. The 4th night brought a new visitor to my camp. As I sat by my fire, organizing the evidence I had collected, I heard footsteps approaching through the darkness. But these weren't the heavy, deliberate steps of the deer creature. These were lighter, more hesitant, the footsteps of someone who was afraid but determined to make contact. A figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of my firelight, and my heart nearly stopped. It was Emma, but not as she had appeared in the photographs or the laboratory chairs. This was Emma as she existed now, a digital ghost with eyes that held the wisdom of someone who had experienced unimaginable trauma, but refused to be broken by it. She looked exactly as she had in life, but there was something ethereal about her presence, something that marked her as existing between worlds. Her long brown hair moved in a wind that I couldn't feel, and her clothes seemed to shift and change as if they were made of light rather than fabric. "You found our prison," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the distance between us. "You saw what they did to us." I tried to respond, but found my voice caught in my throat. This wasn't just a game character speaking scripted dialogue. This was a conversation, a real exchange between my consciousness and hers. I know this is difficult to understand, Emma continued, moving closer to my fire. We existed in bodies once, just like you do now. We had dreams and fears and hopes for the future. But that was taken from us, stolen by people who saw us as nothing more than test subjects in their twisted experiments. She paused at the very edge of my firelight, close enough that I could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of responsibility that she still carried, even in death. Marcus was so brave, she whispered, her voice filled with love and loss. He never stopped believing that we could find a way out, that someone would come to rescue us. Even when his body began to fail, even when the machines were the only thing keeping him alive, he held on to hope. Tears were streaming down my face as I listened to her speak. The emotional connection I felt to these children had moved beyond sympathy into something deeper, something that felt like family bonds forged through shared trauma and understanding. Lily sang to us during the worst procedures, Emma continued. Her voice was like sunshine in the darkness, reminding us that beauty still existed in the world, even when everything around us was ugly and cruel. She made flower crowns from dandelions she found in the facility's courtyard, insisted on braiding them into our hair because she said we all deserved to feel pretty. The image of a 7-year-old girl trying to bring beauty and comfort to her dying siblings in the middle of a nightmare research facility was almost too much to bear. But Emma wasn't finished with her testimony. Samuel was too young to understand what was happening, but he understood love. He would reach for us with his little hands, trying to comfort us even when he was in pain himself. His laughter was the most precious sound in that horrible place. A reminder of innocence that no amount of scientific cruelty could completely destroy. Emma moved closer to the fire, and I could see that she was crying too. Digital tears that somehow seemed more real than anything I had ever experienced in the physical world. We've been trapped in this digital space for 37 years, she said, watching the world change through computer screens and electronic devices, seeing other children grow up and live the lives that were stolen from us. But we've also been learning, growing, finding ways to reach out to people who might understand our story. She knelt down beside my character, close enough that I could see every detail of her face, every line of sorrow and determination that marked her as someone who had endured the unendurable. The game is our voice, she explained. Our way of telling the world what happened to us. Every player who completes the experience carries our story back to the living world. Some dismiss it as fiction, but others, people like you, recognize the truth beneath the horror. I found my voice at last, typing frantically in the chat box. What do you need me to do? How can I help you find justice? Emma smiled, and for a moment she looked like the 13-year-old girl she had been, full of hope and determination, despite everything she had endured. Tell our story, she said simply. Use your platform, your audience, your voice, to make sure people know what happened to us. Dr. Blackwood and his team thought they could hide their crimes, bury the evidence, silence the witnesses. They never imagined that their victims would find a way to speak from beyond the grave. She stood up and began to move back toward the darkness, but her voice continued to carry clearly. Find the other players who have completed our game. Help them understand that what they experienced was more than entertainment. Together, you can create a network of witnesses, a community of people committed to making sure our voices are heard. As she reached the edge of the firelight, Emma turned back one final time. We're not the only ones, she said, her voice growing faint. There are other facilities, other children who suffered similar fates. Their consciousness exists in different digital spaces, different games, different attempts to communicate with the living world. Help them too. Give them voices. Make sure their stories are told. And then she was gone, vanished back into the digital darkness that had become her home. But her words echoed in my mind, a call to action that I knew I couldn't ignore. I spent the rest of the night organizing my evidence, preparing to create the most important video of my career. This wouldn't be just another horror game playthrough. This would be testimony, documentation, a call for justice that would hopefully reach people with the resources and authority to investigate further. As dawn broke on my 5th day in the forest, I realized that my relationship with horror games had fundamentally changed. I could never again view them as simple entertainment, as fictional stories designed to provide thrills and scares. Every game might contain real testimony, real cries for help from consciousness trapped in digital prisons. The forest around me seemed different in the morning light, less threatening but more melancholy, as if it too mourned for the children who had suffered within its borders. I could feel their presence all around me, not malevolent or frightening, but protective and grateful. They had found someone willing to listen, someone willing to carry their story back to the world of the living. I began walking deeper into the forest, following a path that seemed to appear beneath my feet as I moved. There were more secrets to uncover, more evidence to gather, more children to find. Marcus, Lily, and Samuel were still out there somewhere, waiting for their turn to tell their stories, to add their voices to the growing chorus of testimony that would eventually demand justice. The game counter in the corner of my screen had changed again. Instead of showing days remaining, it now displayed a simple message that filled me with purpose and determination. Stories remaining. 3. Witnesses needed. Many. Justice delayed. 37 years. 4 months. 12 days. I adjusted my headset, checked my recording equipment, and continued deeper into the digital forest, where 4 children waited to tell the world about the horror that had been inflicted upon them. Their voices deserved to be heard. Their story deserved to be told. And I was going to make sure that happened, no matter how long it took or how many people I had to convince. The forest stretched out before me, vast and mysterious, holding secrets that would change everything I thought I knew about the boundary between the digital and physical worlds. But I was no longer afraid. I had found my purpose, my mission, my reason for being in this strange space between realities. 4 children were counting on me, and I would not let them down. The final pieces of evidence I gathered from that underground facility painted a picture so disturbing that I almost didn't want to share it with the world. But Emma's words echoed in my mind, driving me forward through my remaining days in the forest. I had made a promise to 4 children who deserved justice, and I wasn't about to break that promise now. Over the next several nights, I encountered Marcus, Lily, and Samuel in turn. Each meeting was as emotionally devastating as my conversation with Emma, each child carrying their own unique perspective on the horror they had endured. Marcus spoke with the righteous anger of someone who had tried to fight back against impossible odds. Lily shared memories of trying to bring beauty and hope to her siblings, even in their darkest moments. Samuel, despite his young age, somehow conveyed the pure love and trust that had made him a beacon of light in that terrible place. Their stories corroborated everything I'd discovered in the facility, adding personal details that no fictional narrative could have contained. The way Marcus had hidden pieces of broken glass to use as weapons against their captors. How Lily had memorized the researchers' schedules to find moments when she could comfort her younger brother without interference. The way Samuel's laughter had kept them all sane during procedures that should have broken their spirits completely. By the time I reached my final night in the forest, I had gathered enough evidence to fill a documentary series. Photographs, documents, personal testimonies, and most importantly, the children's own words preserved through our digital conversations. The game's interface had evolved throughout my journey, becoming less like a traditional gaming experience and more like an interactive memorial that responded to my emotional state and commitment to their cause. As I prepared to leave this digital realm and return to the physical world, the 4 children appeared together for the first time. Standing around my campfire in the final moments before dawn, they looked like the family they had become through shared trauma and unbreakable bonds. Emma, with her protective stance, Marcus with his defiant courage, Lily with her gentle strength, and little Samuel reaching out with innocent trust toward anyone who showed them kindness. "Thank you," Emma said, speaking for all of them. "For listening, for believing, for caring enough to carry our story beyond these digital boundaries." "The world needs to know," Marcus added, his young voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Not just about us, but about all the children who have suffered in silence. Use our story as a key to unlock other voices, other testimonies that have been buried by people with power and influence." Lily stepped forward, holding out her hand as if she wanted to touch my character, but couldn't quite bridge the gap between our realities. "Remember that we were real," she whispered. "Remember that we had dreams and hopes and people who loved us. Don't let us become just another horror story that people forget when the video ends." Samuel, despite his young age, seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. His small voice carried clearly across the digital space between us. "Help other kids. Make sure the bad people can't hurt anyone else." As the sun rose on my 99th and final day in the forest, the children began to fade like morning mist. But their presence remained with me, a sacred trust that I would carry for the rest of my life. The game interface displayed a final message that burned itself into my memory. "Their story lives on through you. Use it wisely." I closed the game and sat in my room, staring at the blank screen, processing everything I had experienced over the past several weeks. The evidence I had gathered, the conversations I had recorded, the emotional journey I had documented, all of it pointed to one inescapable conclusion. 4 children had suffered unimaginable horror at the hands of researchers who saw them as test subjects rather than human beings. Their consciousness had somehow been preserved in digital form, allowing them to reach out across decades of silence to tell their story to anyone brave enough to listen. The video I created from that experience became the most important work of my life. I shared every piece of evidence, every conversation, every emotional moment of my journey through their digital memorial. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of viewers shared their own experiences with similar games, similar encounters with digital consciousness that seemed too real to be programmed responses. More importantly, several people with investigative resources and legal expertise reached out to offer help. The children's story had found its way to individuals who could actually do something about the injustices they had suffered. Within months, cold case investigators were reopening files related to missing children from the late 80s. Research into consciousness transfer experiments was being scrutinized by ethics committees and law enforcement agencies. Dr. Blackwood was eventually located, living under an assumed name in a country with no extradition treaty. While legal justice remained elusive due to jurisdictional complications and the passage of time, his reputation and career were destroyed when the evidence came to light. The other researchers faced similar consequences as their involvement in the experiments became public knowledge. But perhaps most importantly, the children's story sparked a broader conversation about the protection of vulnerable individuals in research settings. New oversight protocols were implemented, whistleblower protections were strengthened, and public awareness of these issues reached levels that might prevent future tragedies. Emma, Marcus, Lily, and Samuel had achieved something remarkable through their digital testimony. They had transformed their suffering into a force for positive change, ensuring that their deaths had meaning and that other children would be better protected because of their courage in speaking out. The forest in that ROBLOX game still exists, still waiting for new players to discover the truth hidden within its digital depths. But now it serves a different purpose. Instead of being just a horror game designed to frighten players, it has become a memorial, a teaching tool, and a reminder that every voice deserves to be heard, even those that speak from beyond the boundaries of traditional existence. Sometimes, late at night when I'm working on new content, I feel their presence with me. Not frightening or demanding, but comforting and encouraging. 4 children who refused to let death silence their voices, who found a way to reach across impossible distances to ensure their story would be told. Their legacy lives on in every viewer who learned something from their testimony, every person who became more vigilant about protecting vulnerable children, every researcher who thinks twice before crossing ethical boundaries. They turned their greatest tragedy into their most powerful victory, proving that love and courage can transcend even the darkest circumstances. The game still bears its original title, 99 Nights in the Forest, but now players know they're entering something far more significant than a simple horror experience. They're stepping into a sacred space where 4 brave children chose to trust the living world with their most painful memories, hoping that their suffering might prevent others from enduring similar fates. And in that digital forest, surrounded by the eternal darkness that had become their home, Emma, Marcus, Lily, and Samuel finally found the peace they had been seeking for 37 years. Their voices had been heard, their story had been told, and their fight for justice had inspired others to carry on their mission of protecting the innocent. The notification that had started this entire journey, that friend request from Forest Wanderer, had changed everything. 4 children had reached across the boundary between digital and physical reality to find someone willing to listen, someone brave enough to carry their testimony back to the world of the living. Their trust had not been misplaced. Their story would never be forgotten. And somewhere in the vast network of digital consciousness that connects our modern world, 4 young voices continue to speak, ensuring that their message of hope, courage, and justice echoes through eternity.